Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, Emerald Planet. All the ecology news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's your host, Executive Director of the Emerald Planet, Dr. Sam Lee Hancock.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock, coming to you from Washington, D.C. in the United States as we look around the globe on a week-to-week basis in 144 different nations, looking for those 1,000 best practices, the technologies, services, and products that making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And of course, we're looking for those special leaders that are having a real impact as far as getting ready for another 2 billion people to join us on planet Earth. And we have a gentleman who's looking at how do we actually increase the productivity and the quality of life here in many traditional and classical ways that actually will be a leading edge as far as where we're going in the 21st century. Gentleman that's going to be joining us from by Skype is James. He goes by Jim H. Laurie. He's a restoration ecologist. Biodiversity for a Livable Climate is the organization. He's also a biologist from Rice University and a pioneer in biological remediation of wastewater. And we're going to be talking about a number of different issues. And Jim, welcome to the Emerald Planet TV. And sitting right beside me is Jose Rios, and he is the professor retired of the University of Puerto Rico. And he's here as our special guest. So Jim, welcome to the Emerald Planet TV.
Hello, Sam. Hello, Jose.
Glad to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about your leadership role as a restoration ecologist for the Biodiversity for a Livable Climate.
Well, about in the last 30 years, I've been collecting ideas about where the land was actually getting healthier. And I moved to Boston about 10 years ago, and a lot of friends were involved in the climate movement. And to me, the climate issue is mostly an issue of loss of biodiversity in different parts of the world. And if we could reverse that, then the amount of carbon would go back in the soils. And now we're learning that the water cycle is actually another player in that whole thing, that biodiversity will improve the water cycle, and then the carbon cycle will follow right along. So that's exciting news. So.
Well, I never heard of this title before, restoration ecologist. When was that developed, and how long has it been around, and are there others in the profession working with you?
Years ago, we used to talk about conservation, and it seemed like every time that we tried to conserve something and then a compromise was made that we had less to conserve. And, I don't know, along again in the 1990s, I began to realize that a lot of places could actually be restored, and maybe virtually everywhere if you had the ability to look at the whole process and learn what the keystone species were. So yeah, restoration's a possibility. And
well, we talk about it and actually for many years now, Jim, and Emerald Planet, about the fact of being able to hopefully stop and maybe even reverse climate change. So it's just fantastic, the work that you're doing. Tell us a little bit about your organization, which I think you're one of the founders of, this Biodiversity for a Livable Climate.
Well, this started from, like I say, from a lot of the climate people, but it was also the organic farmers, and it was mostly friends of mine that kept wanting to spread this message, and largely from an activist role. Whereas from my perspective, I look at my role as more of a teacher and trying to help people see how to learn from nature and what nature can teach us, about a better future. So.
Well, I met some of the leaders of your organization, and I just think it's fantastic what it is that you're doing. Jose, why don't you ask the third question?
Yes, good evening, Jim. This is Jose.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? What do you see as the central issues in addressing climate issues and global climate change through the perennial grasses and mycorrhizal fungi keys to deep, spongy soil projects?
Nature knows how to take carbon out of the air and put it in the soils.
Yeah.
And the most powerful way to do that is through perennial grasses, and what we've learned is that perennial grasses will actually give up half their their carbon to underground projects. You know, they're growing roots, and then they're giving it off to fungi. Fungi can do a lot more with the same amount of carbon than plant roots can. And in fact, the symbiosis has been going on since plants evolved on the land. Fungi have always been really critical to finding the minerals and the nutrients, but they need energy, and they get that from the grasses. So, and then, you know, as we show the slides.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that, Jim, because this is really a dynamic part of all this. So I'm just going to let you talk, and if I want to chime in, I will, but if not, I'm just going to let you kind of talk through these.
Well, last week we had a conference, and it was about the water cycle and how to restore biodiversity through the water cycle and look at climate that way. And what we had is a guy named Michael Kravchuk come all the way from Slovakia to talk with us. And he has made the comments that more water is flowing off the continents right now than comes onto the continents. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. And the amount of water we're losing from continents, by his estimation, is more than the volume of Lake Erie. And this is a picture of Lake Erie where I grew up. And that's every year we're losing that amount of water. And why is that? And it's largely because we've lost so much biodiversity. And so then we can move on. Say if we go back 20,000 years when there were woolly mammoths running around in North America, and you see lions there and so forth, the amount of nutrients that these animals would bring from the lowlands up to the highlands in a given year, they go, you know, south for part of the year, come north as the weather got better. But we had a CO2 level in the atmosphere back then of anywhere from 180 to 240, and it was ice age most of the time. We were taking an awful lot of carbon out of the air and putting it into the soils, and a lot of it had to do with these grazing animals kept moving by predators. So, but maybe that's too cold for us. Now this is a picture taken, and you look at it first, and it looks like just desert, but it's actually the Red River near the Oklahoma border. And there's virtually no water flowing. This is in November. And as CO2 levels approach 400, we're seeing parts of Texas that are just drying up, and the soil's being sterilized by the heat. So, and here's, so that might be considered too hot, but now let's look back a couple hundred years before Lewis and Clark. And the prairies had, maybe 100 million grazing animals. Buffalo, antelope, bighorn sheep were numerous, elk, and they also had all kinds of things that were digging in the soil and making holes. So that was at a time when the water, when it rained out there, it would just virtually most of it would go into the soil. And you see this is actually in Washington D.C. So you guys ought to go down and see this at the National Arboretum, I believe. I'm not sure. But you can see there that the root systems of these perennial grasses are taller than this woman standing there. So, the roots might go down 8 or 10 feet. Wow. And it's quite a project to make these roots. That's a lot of carbon going down. So here's what the root systems look like close up on big blue stem. And it seems like when ranchers get the grazing right, almost anywhere in the West, grasses like big blue stem show up. And they may have been there virtually everywhere when the buffalo were numerous. And so tests were run in South Dakota a few years back to figure out how do you get water to infiltrate into the ground. And they looked at 3 different sites within a few miles of each other. And in a cornfield, it took about 25 minutes for the water to go down into the ground. And the typical grazing system that they had, a continuous grazing system where the animals are stocked all year long, the number was more like 7 minutes. So that sounds pretty good. But where they were moving the animals and trying to simulate buffalo herds, the number was more like 10 seconds. But the soil was almost porous. It was like bread. So here you've got Peter Donovan, who's been studying this quite a bit, and he came to Massachusetts and went out on the campus of UMass Amherst and ran this same infiltration test. And this is on Kentucky bluegrass, which is what we use on our on our suburban lawns everywhere, and that's starting to show up in a lot of places in the West. Kentucky bluegrass has virtually no roots, and the numbers he got was about 48 minutes for an inch of water to get down. So that would explain flooding in suburban areas. It's quite remarkable. And here's just a shot of comparing the two, and you can see blue stem puts roots down maybe 10 feet, whereas on the left side there, Kentucky bluegrass has virtually no roots at all. So just something to think about. So now, why feed all of your carbon that you're assimilating into sugars? Why feed it the fungi? And it turns out fungi are very well adapted for finding minerals, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and they can bring water from some really, tiny little cracks in the soil. So here's a couple ideas. This is some. When I was living in Maryland, actually, I was growing mushrooms, and this will give you an idea of how dense the mycelium can be, the fungi mycelium. So, and anybody, can you recognize these? These are oyster mushrooms. And this is actually grown out at Paul Stamets' farm in Washington State. And probably if you want to learn about fungi, Paul Stamets is the best place to go. He's the master. Fungi.org or fungi.com or whatever. So.
Jose, we got time for 2 more questions, Jim, and we have to be quick.
Okay.
Yes, Jim, based on these incredible graphs and your previous research work, how long do you think it takes for a project to begin to change the local climate and the environment?
Well, I don't know about climate so much, because that's a big thing, but what we've seen with ranchers in West Texas and in different parts of the world, if they get their grazing right and start moving their herds in a particular way, the water cycle can improve very quickly. The water starts to infiltrate under the ground, and you'll actually see water bubbling up from the bottom and streams running clear rather than having runoff. You don't have the flash flooding that you would have before. So that's exciting to me. Ranchers, would be excited if you had, had clear water and streams that ran months out of the year instead of days. So.
Jim, we have about 20 seconds left, so we got to be quick. What do you see for the expansion and growth of your organization, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate?
I don't know. I mean, I've been amazed at how much we've done so far. We've had 2 big conferences in the last couple of years and several small ones. We've got a group in Washington, D.C. working with us now from good friends of ours, and I have no idea. We're kind of amazed we've come this far.
That's fantastic. This is James, goes by Jim H. Laurie, Restoration Ecologist, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. And sitting right beside me is Jose Rios. I'm Dr. Sam Hancock, and thank you for being with us as we look around the globe as we create the Emerald Planet.
Art, a universal language, an expression of culture, of self. And now, thanks to Empowered Women International, a way for emerging and established immigrant and refugee artists and artisans to find hope to earn a living while enriching the lives of all of us. Empowered Women International, making a better America every day. For more information on Empowered Women International's educational programs or to make a tax-free donation, contact cfrip at AOL.com.
You'd think it would be easy to tell which kids have trouble with their eyesight. But that's not always the case. Even though 1 in 4 children may have a vision problem, eye doctors tell us the symptoms aren't always so obvious. We do know that 80% of all childhood learning is visual. And without good vision, kids can have trouble learning to read and may fall behind in school. For clues on how to spot the real-life signs of childhood vision problems and what parents can do, visit checkyearly.com. A public service message from the Vision Council of America, and reading is fundamental.
We're back to the Inside Scoop Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello, and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you weekly from Washington, D.C. in the United States as we're looking for those 1,000 best practices, the technologies, services, and products that are making a difference as we move towards 2050. By 2050, it's estimated we'll have maybe 9 billion people on the planet, and by the end of the century, maybe as many as 12 to 13 billion. So how are we going to provide the food, the fuel, the fiber, all those things we need for humanity at the same time to protect the environment? We have a gentleman who's been working most of his professional career in actually solving and trying to look at these various issues, the integration of classical, traditional methods, as well as how to reverse climate change. This is James. He goes by Jim H. Laurie. He's a restoration ecologist with the Biodiversity for a Livable Climate organization. And we're going to be talking this time, Jim, about a topic called herds of moving ruminants feeding billions of dung beetles. That's quite a title you picked out there. And then sitting right beside me is Dr. Jose Colucci Rios, who is a professor retired from the University of Puerto Rico, but Jim is coming in by Skype, and Jose is our special guest. So anyway, Jim, welcome to the Emerald Planet TV.
Well, hello, Sam. Hi, Jose.
Glad to have you with us. One of your professional titles, I was intrigued by this. It's called Pioneer of Biological Remediation of Wastewater. That's a very long title. And how has this work been important to your leadership roles there with the Biodiversity for a Livable Climate organization?
I used to work in the chemical industry. I'm getting feedback a little bit. I used to work in the chemical industry with, and I learned a lot from a guy named John Todd up here in New England, and he was real helpful in having me understand that if you increase the biodiversity of an aquatic system, virtually the water becomes very clean. Some of the worst pollutants just become they're broken down by the complexity of the biodiverse systems. Mm-hmm. And until we tried this in the chemical plant with really nasty, we had some things like ammonia in our outfall water. We had chloroform. We had some of the hormone analogs and things like that. And we found that if they went through marsh systems and aquatic systems, that they would be broken down. We'd see just very good water.
That's absolutely amazing.
So that kind of helps when you start thinking about how do we restore wetlands in the United States, and I've got some ideas coming up on that soon.
Mm-hmm. So. That's fantastic. Well, I just really like this title. Some of it's probably the yuck factor and all this. But how did this project and some of the other work you're doing really address this issue as far as extreme and impactful climate change? And how is that really, these types of projects can really help to possibly even reverse severe climate change?
We've probably lost more carbon from soils in the last few hundred years than is in the atmosphere altogether. And how do we put it back? And the best way to put it back, of course, grasslands can absorb a lot of carbon by photosynthesis and put it into ground. But then to have a good grassland, you need to have grazing ruminants. And these are like huge reactors walking around on the land, and they're chewing up cellulose. And cellulose is really hard to break down. And when they poop it out the other end, it's still a pretty good resource for other organisms. But if you leave the poop on the ground, you suddenly have a fly problem with your animals and that kind of thing. What if we could do what happened, a couple hundred years ago? You wouldn't see this poop for more than, maybe a day, maybe less, because dung beetles would be following the herds, and they'd be burying this stuff. And each little pellet that the dung beetles bury has a baby dung beetle in it. It's like the beginning of their lives starts in a pile of poop, and it's something that's full of energy for them. So
you're feeding them and also feeding the earth at the same time, then.
Well, absolutely. That's carbon going into the soil, and it's also water infiltration. You know, if you're concerned about water, the more little pores you can put into it, the more holes you can drill into it, and this would happen automatically. Now, what happened to that process? Well, we've been using antibiotics with our animals, which, you know, really stresses the dung beetles, and then we've been using insecticides to get rid of the flies because we don't keep the animals moving. And so, so you're kind of like defeating yourself because the dung beetles die out, and then the poop gets worse in terms of fly habitat, and then they use more sprays, and it gets to be kind of a downward spiral. So.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and the whole thing is using chemicals to treat something that can be done biologically certainly doesn't make much sense, either from the cost factor, but also the long-term impact on the environment, and I think that's what you're finding, Jim. Jose, your question.
Yes, Jim, elaborating on these interactions, could you explain how can such a simple concept create profound environmental impacts?
Well, I mean, I think the people that do some of this, you know, are pretty courageous because it's hard when you're being told all your life that there's a certain way to do it, and we get into this this kind of treadmill of more and more and more chemicals. But then once you get into it, you really get excited. People say, well, it takes more work to move animals than it does to just keep them in the same place, and that's true. But I think you get excited when you see the land coming back and the more vegetation. The first place I saw this was out in West Texas, and a family was deep in debt, and they couldn't afford the chemicals anymore. And they started leasing some of their land to people bringing herds in, and they found that they got a lot more grass, and it was pretty soon, and the water cycle improved. So you know, I thought, well, in a place like that, out near the Pecos River, you could, if you can do it out there, you can do it in a lot of other places too. So.
Let's go through some of these slides that we have that you provided for us, Jim. This is absolutely fantastic, and we'll just move these along for you, and I'm just going to let you talk for a while.
I had some of my homeschool students actually speak at the conference, and they played roles of some of the different species, and they were doing some calculations, and they figured out that when there were 60 million buffalo out there, it was something like I don't know, several hundred million tons of free fertilizer every year was put on the land. And these animals, I mean, you can see why they'd have to move, because if they stayed in one place, they'd stay in herds to protect themselves from predators, but if they start to stink up the place pretty fast, they'd start moving towards the sweet grass. And they wouldn't come back to the place that they'd stunk up until it was sweet again. So the idea of intense grazing and then long periods of recovery until the grass came back, this was a natural system, you know. Predators were important in the process, but think of all that free fertilizer, you know, hundreds of millions of tons every year from all that poop. So, and here's there's a picture here of buffalo and pronghorn, and down there a little lower is the prairie dogs, and there was, if you remember those pictures last segment, I had pictures of Texas where it was very, very dry, and out in that same area about 120 years ago, there was a prairie dog town the size of Ireland. It had about 400 million prairie dogs, and imagine all the holes that were being pushed into the soil. It was probably 20,000 holes per square mile.
That's an incredible amount of rain runoff that could actually go down and nourish the soil and get down to the bottom of the roots, because you talked about some of those root systems that go down 8, 10, 12 feet.
And I hear people, say, well, prairie dogs are always where the best grass is. I've heard this in Texas. I've heard it in Montana. Well, that's something to think about.
Yeah, there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah, I mean, prairie dogs do graze grass, but they also, I've never seen prairie dog towns that were, I think when you have prairie dogs, you have to have predators, and you have to watch them, but you can also capture a lot of water, which is kind of the goal. So. This picture's from West Texas, out near the Pecos. This area had no animals on it for years, maybe 20 or 30 years. And this was taken in January, so the grass is from the previous year. but they're running sheep and cattle in the same area, and the grass is starting to grow again. These perennial grasses had disappeared, and then they just reappeared. The seed seems to always be there for decades, waiting for the herd to come by. And here's another stand. This was in May, and they got a pretty good rain that year, and so there's a cane blue stem popping up. And their grazing system, they were running about 2.5 times recommended rates of animals. They'd graze them for a week in an area and then give them 24 weeks rest. And it seems that worked pretty well. And then they had some professors out there counting. These folks, the Richardsons, came out from University of Texas and started counting dung beetles. And they'd see, you know, they would make the statement they'd bury a ton of wet manure per acre per day, but I think that was a very low number in their estimates, because you know, they were seeing thousands of dung beetles on each cow patty in a healthy system, and that's a lot of holes in the ground and a lot of poop going down. This is from Africa. Another picture here. I made the comment in Cambridge here in Massachusetts one day that dung beetles are starving all over the world. And somebody in the audience said, well, what do they eat? And nobody laughed. See, out west, people would laugh at that. So I thought we've got a lot to learn here. But this is the range of dung beetles originally. And you can see that they were pretty much everywhere. They've been pretty much poisoned out in a lot of places. The only places you didn't see them was in the permafrost, which is pretty hard territory for dung beetles. So,
Jim, we have 2 last questions, and we have to be quick. Go ahead, Jose.
Okay.
Yes, Jim, based on your experience, and how long do you think, how long do you estimate that this project will begin to change the environment?
You know, the word's getting out there. In the 80s, when I first became aware of some of this stuff, you were hard put to find a few dozen case studies, but now it's easily in the thousands. I can't keep track of all the activity. If you look for it, you'll find a lot going on. People are, you know, land's drying up in a lot of places because of this desiccation process.
Well, this is James H. Laurie. He's a restoration ecologist, biodiversity for a livable climate. Sitting right beside me is Dr. Jose Colucci Rios, and he's a professor retired, University of Puerto Rico. And thank you for being with us as we look at this important topic, how to restore the earth as we create the Emerald Planet.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about nothing very nice. Homeless minds. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water. At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site. That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff. You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
We're back to the Inside Scoop Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you on a weekly basis looking around the globe for those 1,000 best practices and of course the people that are making a difference. People that are providing the leadership but also the thought leadership as well as the research that's making a difference as we try to address critical climate change and the ways that we're going to be able to take care of a planet that will have about 9 billion people by 2050. And we have a gentleman that's joining us by Skype who has been working on this most of his professional career. This is James. He goes by Jim H. Laurie. He's a restoration ecologist, biodiversity for a livable climate. He's also a biologist out of Rice University and a big long title, pioneer for biological remediation of wastewater. Jim, I just had to throw that in. I just love it. And this particular theme is going to be about rehydrating Texas. Now, it's always bigger in Texas, so this is amazing. And we're going to do it by grazing and prairie dogs. So I think this is going to be a very interesting topic. So, Jim, welcome back. And then right beside me, of course, is Dr. Jose Colucci Rios. He's a professor retired out of the University of Puerto Rico, and he's here as our special guest. But Jim, you started your professional career in biology at Rice University. Tell us a little bit about the STEM and why is such STEM courses so important today as we move through the 21st century and we're facing really very severe and impactful climate change.
Well, I don't want to give the misimpression. I went to Rice University, got my biology degree there. I never actually worked there, but I think that's an amazing school, and it was a really good school for me. And the second part of your question?
Yeah, the whole thing about the STEM. Why are all the biological sciences, the hard sciences, engineering, mathematics, all that? Why is it so important today as we're heading towards 2050 and a planet that will have some 9 billion people?
I was really lucky because I had incredibly good teachers from 7th grade on, and a lot of it had to do with Sputnik. That science education became very important in the 60s and 70s, and I think we've trailed off a little bit. And I've been thinking about that a lot. Now I teach homeschool kids, and I want them to do learn their math and do all that, and I want them to see possibilities. It's interesting that this generation doesn't remember us going to the moon. And, that's real interesting to me, that the emphasis on science education's kind of lagged behind, I think, a little bit. And
well, that's like ancient history as far as most people are concerned with the youthful population. Yeah. But, with scientists and environmentalists and of course, citizens in general think we're doomed right now to a series of droughts and negative climate impacts as we go through the 21st century. But you've really been doing research and actually involved in projects that are actually slowing down, possibly even reversing the impact of such severe climate change. Tell us a little bit about your faith as far as some of the projects. And it's just like this slide we have right here, Make Soil. A friend of mine calls it growing soil to end climate warming. Why can you say that so emphatically, and what are we looking at that gives you faith that that really is the case?
I drew that picture on a poster, it was in 2009, and it was kind of a challenge to the climate activists here in Boston to say, where is this wrong? And I believe it a lot more now than when I drew it. It's we're finding more and more evidence that healthy natural systems can put an awful lot of carbon in the ground, through perennial grasses and fungi, but also through all the commotion of herding animals that are on the move, and all the poop they leave behind, and actually all the hoof prints they leave. At one time, there used to be maybe 4 or 5 hoof prints per square foot. Great big grazing animals penetrating the soil on every square foot, and so the water inevitably would go down into the ground. And like I say, you could put if we put a quarter of the carbon that has come up from the soil back into the soil, we'd be more concerned about ice ages. These systems will regenerate themselves. I just wonder if humans want to be part of the symbiotic process, or are we going to fade away as a species? It's kind of interesting.
Now, looking at this change, Jim, that we're talking about, and you're talking about be worried about ice ages instead of the global warming aspects, but looking at that as far as the amount of land available, say in the continental United States, is there enough that we can really reverse the impacts if we had actually follow some of these very simple principles?
Definitely. There's probably 10 billion acres of rangelands that have lost most of their half or more of their carbon in their soils, and there's another 5 billion that we're managing as croplands that are losing soil too, because one of the problems in croplands is if you use nitrogen fertilizers, the bacterial community starts growing like crazy, and the fungi disappear in your soils, and most of our cornlands have very little ability to support fungi, and so it's like trying to grow corn on concrete. So not a very helpful thing if you're worried about climate. So.
Absolutely not. Jose, question?
Yes, Jim. How come there's such an emphasis upon removal of prairie dogs from the Great Plains states over the last 150 years? And what have been the negative impacts of such removal?
Well, as far as why, that's a really good question. I think probably what happened is when they eliminated predators from West Texas, like coyotes and wolves and so forth, the prairie dogs probably went through a population explosion and probably ate a lot of grass. So they need to be kept in control too to some extent. But the way we went about it was we tried to eliminate every last one. And what happened then was the soil really began to dry out. It didn't have the ability to take in. When we did have rain, it wouldn't go down; it'd just run right off. And here you see a cotton field out in West Texas that they probably have to irrigate to keep that going. They've already picked the cotton in this particular case, but you might notice there's no dark matter in the soil. It's turning red. There's very little organic matter. And it's pretty typical out there. There's very few animals in West Texas now. Most of them have gone to the feedlots. And I put this in here. You see a lot of mesquite in West Texas. And farmers, ranchers will spend a lot of money on chemicals to try to defeat mesquite. And they'll come in with bulldozers and they'll get all the stuff together, then they'll burn it, and you can see a pile of the stuff that's been burned out front. And you can see a lot of white stuff in that burning. And that's caliche. That's actually almost like limestone. So you see we're running out of topsoil, and we're getting down to the bedrock in a lot of places. So what they might do here is they might bring in seed and try to grow some grass and then run some animals. But I think it'd be a better way. And this kind of shocked me when I saw this. This is caliche. They're trying to grow some hay, so you can see that they planted it. But this is near Dallas. This is an area in the East Texas that gets about 40 inches of rain, and yet the soils are disappearing there too. And that's really scary. And so when they had 13 inches of rain last year in Dallas, they had a flood for 3 or 4 days, and then the water was gone. They were back in drought. Here's an interesting picture. This came out in the 1950s. They found, and you can see there's actually two people in that picture. And one is sitting on the original topsoil, 4 feet higher than where the other guy's standing. And what is holding that remnant together is bluestem, big bluestem grass, and that's out in New Mexico. And people in New Mexico now think big bluestem is an invasive species or it wasn't native out there, but it definitely was. And it was when there were big herds. So when they did the big plow up out there, the soil just blew away, 4 feet of it. So, I was had my homeschool kids try to figure out how much water would go down if you had tons and tons of prairie dogs. Like I said before, there was one prairie dog town in Texas that was the size of, well, not as big as Maine, but as big as Ireland, and densities of 15,000, 20,000 animals. And the interesting thing was it was never as dry as it is now out there. Now, you can argue about how many you want to have, but what I want is a lot of holes in the ground so that the water can penetrate in the ground and start this process again. And you know, there's a lot of ways to do that. Some ranchers have done it with just the hoof action and you know, the dung beetles, bringing them back and so forth, and they've started to restore that process. But I think if I had land out there, I'd want to hire some prairie dogs for a while and bring in some ferrets and bring in some coyotes and try to balance the system. So I think if, you know, and here's another example. This is South Dakota, and this is on the Lakota Reservation. And notice what you see, what I see there is a tremendous amount of forage and just not enough animals to eat it all and convert it into beef and into poop to start making soil again. But they're really interested in figuring out what to do. But if you look in the background of this picture, you'll see that it's a rolling landscape and there's trees in every low point. And the interesting thing about that was the water table is only a few inches below the surface in a lot of places. That they could have these streams running virtually all the time and have water available for their animals. So this is Dugan Bad Warrior, and on the right, and he's talking with Ridge Shin, who's probably our best grazier here in Massachusetts. And Dugan's real interested in this dung beetle idea and the idea of could we bring beaver into this area, you know? And the issue out there is that, well, beaver are, you know, and it's a poor area, so they see beaver as $100 as a pelt. But they've got them out there, as you can see, and I think that's maybe the biggest story of all is what the beaver were once the North American continent. So,
Jim, we got almost running out of time as usual when we talk with you. So, Jose, last question. We got to be quick, Jim.
Yeah, quickly. How long one of these projects you will start to see or begin to see a change in the environment?
Well, again, I say in the first 2 or 3 years, you can be amazed at the improvements in the water cycle. You know, it's pretty much we've seen that everywhere. If people really understand it, and I think you ought to be shooting for that. A lot of times it's just getting off the chemicals and start moving your animals, and you can begin to see improvements. So.
Excellent.
Jim, what do you see for the future of these types of strategies as far as improving the climate and reducing climate change? And we have about 20 seconds to go through all that. Got to be quick.
Well, how do we do it on 5 continents simultaneologist? That's a real good question. I'm curious about that.
We've lost. This is Jim Laurie, who is a restoration ecologist, biodiversity for a livable climate. And this is sitting right beside me is Dr. Jose Colucci Rios, professor, retired of Puerto Rico. And thank you for being with us as we create the Emerald Planet.
Saving for retirement might be easy for some folk, but for others, it might take a little more work. And for those who haven't started, there are still things you can do to catch up.
Oh, that is good news.
Like getting out from underneath past debt. And don't get wrapped up with high-interest credit cards.
Get you some eyes.
Be diversified with your investments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Your financial goals are not out of reach. The choice is clear. For a happy ending, choose to save.
Everyone with alcohol and drug addiction is in the same boat. With treatment, you can find solid ground. For drug and alcohol information and treatment referral for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP.
Dude, are you sure you want this tattoo? Because just do it.
Some mistakes in life are permanent. Like hearing loss. To learn how to protect your hearing, visit asha.org.
You've probably heard about heart disease, but did you know that it's the #1 killer of women nationwide? Heart disease claims more lives each year than breast cancer, lung cancer, or strokes combined. But there are steps you can take to protect yourself against it. For more information on how you can prevent heart disease, contact your local American Heart Association or visit their website at www.americanheart.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock, the President and Executive Director of Emerald Planet TV in Washington, D.C. of the United States. We come to you on a week-to-week basis, looking around the globe for those 1,000 best practices, technologies, services, and products that are making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And in these various countries, we're looking for the leadership, of course, that it's making a difference with new and novel ways to address severe climate change, but at the same time to revert back so that we can restore the soil and also the air and water quality. And so through all this, we can bring balance to nature at the same time that we're going to be adding another 2 billion people to the earth. We have a gentleman who's been working at this most of his professional career. This is James H. Laurie, goes by Jim, restoration ecologist, biodiversity for a livable climate. And we're going to be talking about Leave It to the Beavers, a solution for a 21st century drought. And sitting right beside me is Dr. Jose Colucci Rios. He is a professor retired from the University of Puerto Rico. And Jim's coming to us by Skype. And Jim, welcome to the Emerald Planet TV.
Hello, Sam. Hello, Jose.
Glad to have you with us. I think this is absolutely fascinating about this beavers. I'm going to leave this image up for just a minute. But describe some of the academic studies and professional research that led you to help create the nonprofit Biodiversity for a Livable Climate.
Well, I'd say my role was mostly teaching. I think I had a lot of friends of mine that got really interested in this, and they went out and did the studies. And in fact, we had one of my friends, Seth Itzkan, went out to Zimbabwe and really started trying to figure out what was going on there with the work of Alan Savory. Alan I knew back in Texas back in the 90s, and yeah, it's what we're amazed at is when people let nature teach them how to restore the landscapes. They can have a lot of success. So
I think it's absolutely fantastic. And your role as a restoration ecologist, with Biodiversity Organization is really important. But why are your colleagues reverting back to these more traditional classical methods of addressing severe climate change when most people think there must be technological answers to everything in today's world? But you're really going in the opposite direction. Why is that?
I don't know if we're going the opposite direction. I think the technological is fine. I just don't think it can possibly do the job by itself. And natural systems, there's so many other advantages in terms of water quality, in terms of healthier food, for a lot of reasons. And the idea of, climate change is a symptom of the loss of biodiversity. And we continue on this road of simplifying nature at our own peril, in my understanding. So,
well, we have this image behind us, and Jose is going to ask you a question about where we're going as far as land, water, and soil management. So, Jose?
Yes. Yes, Jim, if I understood correctly, the holistic land, water, and soil management practices, they're reverting to welcoming beavers into ranching and farming communities. Aren't beavers mutually exclusive from ranching and farming operations?
A year ago, this has really grabbed me because I was particularly interested in places in Texas that were, and in other parts of the country that were so dry that I couldn't imagine beaver being out there. There wasn't any wood. And then we heard this story about beaver in Nevada, which is the driest state. And what beavers do, if they can get any water at all, is dig down channels that are 8 and 10 feet deep. So they're like, they just dig, and what happens is these channels hold so much water that they have to last all year round. So that's their survival. And when I saw that, and then you think about beavers putting so much wood underwater, well, they can use other vegetation too. And once they get the system started, the willows and the aspens can come back, pretty fast because there's so much water available. It was just mind blowing when I got to thinking about how they could do that. And then if you're a rancher, well, then you've got water that stays on the land, and the water tables rise, and that's very exciting to a lot of the ranchers that are seeing this. So.
We're going to walk through some of these slides you provided, Jim, because this is another example of a very practical, classical way of trying to maintain or actually increase the environmental quality of these areas, both the land, air, and water. So let's just go through these and just tell us what we're seeing and why are the impacts so great? And it's something that we've really not thinking about as humans and maybe just totally overlooking these processes.
So, yeah, well, this is, of course, this is in the Rocky Mountains. I'm not sure where this picture was taken, but PBS had a special on beavers just this last year. And that'd be a good place for people that are curious about this to learn a little bit about it. So, and then this is a map of California, and the green area is the area where beavers once thrived. And the Russians were here on the California coast taking otter pelts and beaver pelts, maybe in the 1600s, early 1700s. And then the English were trying to get rid of all the beaver in the Sierra Nevada in the 1820s so that the Americans wouldn't go west. They forgot about the gold. But what happened was when settlers got out here, they didn't think beaver had been out here that much. They didn't see very many of them. And but the thing was that where California is now, with the inability to hold snowpack in the mountains, they've got to stop that water from going to the ocean, and they've got to keep it as long as possible. And beaver are the natural possibility for that. And I'm showing a picture here of a new flag for the state of California, which instead of the golden bear, which I think would be great if the golden bear came back too, the big grizzly bear. But what if beaver were on the state flag? And Caltech beaver's their symbol. So I'm rooting for the governor of California to make beaver voting citizens. So.
Well, you got this beaver range. This is something that most people probably wouldn't even consider possible, and yet it spreads across North America, most of it, and then across Europe into Asia.
This is something I didn't know too, but beaver were eradicated from Asia and most of Europe by the 1300s.
Wow.
And what could it be like if they came back? You know, and right now we're going through the Dust Bowl times in Mongolia because they're trying to turn grazing land into farmland, which is very hard to do. We didn't do a very good job of it. But what if beaver came back and the symbiosis between humans and grazing and that could start to go on out there? Of course, we've got a lot of work to do here. This is actually a picture of a woman that's on our board here, and she's in Concord, Massachusetts, and they bought a house not far from Boston, and it was a golf course out back. You know, the guy liked to golf, and they just decided they wanted to do something different. And within 2 years, the beaver came back, and they've got more insects and more insect-eating birds and kingfishers and everything else back there, and they're pretty excited. The beaver used to be all over North America, and they took care of the water cycle. They are. Right. There were probably 100 million of them in the lower 48. So this is a rainfall map, and it's probably hard to see on TV, but the driest state in the nation, when I always put this picture up, is Nevada. And so we got some folks coming out from Northeast Nevada to our conference, and that's on the next slide there. And Carol Evans is a biologist that's been working on the same streams since the late 80s. And she knows this land. I mean, we don't have many field biologists that are that dedicated. And Susie Creek is one of her favorite places, and it's been getting, you know, the beaver showed up in about 2003, and you can see how it's changing out there, that it holds more and more water. But Carol Evans will tell you that if the ranchers hadn't been doing their grazing and trying to figure out how to keep the animals moving, and these streams would have never supported enough water to bring beaver back. And so we've got John Griggs there, who I believe was on your show last week. And he's kind of a slow-talking guy, but he'll say, well, you know, we do have trout in our streams again, and we do have beaver And that might not be good, you know, for cows, but we sure like having all that water. And so maybe the ideas will start shifting out there. This picture, I took this in South Dakota, and just to show how many shells, you know, they had a flood and all these shells showed up. North America used to be all the streams were freshwater mussel habitat, and those have died away in a lot of places because humans put dams in the rivers, and the fish that freshwater mussels depend on to move upstream when they're babies are you know, not able to get upstream. And freshwater mussels can't do they don't swim by themselves very well. But these little babies actually attach to the fish gills or to the fish bodies and get hitchhiked upstream back when the system worked. And I just wanted to put that in there to, in Massachusetts, the Department of Ecological Restoration is knocked down about 40 dams, and beaver have come back in a lot of places. And the fish can get upstream with beaver dams. That's not a problem. And he's hoping to knock down like 1,000 dams here in Massachusetts and help this part of the biological process. And if you want to start learning about this, I've got 2 books, Water and Natural History by Alice Outwater. It was written about 20 years ago. Cows Save the Planet by Judy Schwartz, who really gets into the grazing side of things, and many other things too. And my last picture there, that's I've had 2 homeschool classes now, and those are their textbooks. Is what you just saw, Water and Cows, and they've been to see the living machines here. There's a aquaculture system, and I'm really proud of them because they're trying to figure out. I call them the restorers, and you know, we had 4 kids last year take their AP biology test and pass, and you know, they're 15. They're taking it 2 years earlier than most of the kids that take that test. So.
We have only about 10 seconds left. What do you see for the future in all this, Jim? All these traditional methods.
Well, let nature teach you, and then when you learn something, share it with people.
Yeah. That's absolutely fantastic. This is Jim Laurie, restoration ecologist, biodiversity for a livable climate. Sitting right beside me is Dr. Jose Colucci. He is a professor retired at the University of Puerto Rico. And Jose, thank you for being with us. Jim, thank you for being with us and sharing all this fantastic information, the images, and the knowledge that you've gained over all these years of professional experience as we create the Emerald Planet.